I'm not actually wearing it, but in honor of today, thought I would
Wow.
show off my Sauron merch,
So, and
hot off the press from Mordor.
a quick intro. Turner is going to talk to us about Sauron. Can you hold that up one more time?
Yes. There's the front.
Mm,
Here's the back. Got the eye.
wow. It, it, was that available at a normal store? How did you come across that beautiful prize?
I think my wife got it for me, and I think it's an online store that sells, various Lord of the Rings t-shirts and sweatshirts, and it was a good one.
Well, he's back. Turner Burnett, how you doing?
I'm doing swell.
I
Ready
think
to
this
take
is
the plunge.
let's jump right into old Sauron. But I was going to say before I do this a lot. I tend to jump around. I believe this is your third appearance on the plunge.
Mm,
Is that correct?
I think
Do you
so, yeah.
do you know? I
I think it's
I'm
3,
trying to
yeah.
remember if you had a solo appearance because you appeared with Thomas and you appeared with your father David. You might have had another one.
I don't know. I think it's just been those 2,
Okay. All right.
which
Well,
were made much better by them not being solo, so we'll see how this one goes.
I think it's time for the little bird to fly the nest alone here. So off you go. We were talking before we jumped on this, and I was referencing how so many of the Tolkien characters have a intense love of their homeland, and that I thought that it was connected to Tolkien's own very formative experience serving in World War One. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, but then you made a comment with respect to your character Sauron as the antithesis of that. So run with that, please.
Yeah. Well, I just thought it was a great point that you brought up. I don't know that I'd really thought about that before, but about Tolkien's characters having this love of homeland. But I do think you're right that there's in the heroes that he presents, there is this allegiance to something larger than themselves, something that they see their own contribution as sacrifice unto some greater good, which ultimately points back to and adds value to their community. And so, for Sam Gamgee, I don't think there's anywhere he'd rather be than in a flourishing Shire, taking care of his family. And so everything he does outside of the Shire points back to that end and contributes to that end. Um, and even in characters like what you were referencing in our conversation before, Boromir, who even, ends up falling and then kind of repenting right before his death and seeing his fault, but his allegiance to homeland, to Gondor, and to fighting for the honor of his family, of his father, of his people. And it just in reaction to your observation there that I thought was a keen observation, just realized that I think Sauron would be, unique in that regard, that he doesn't have any sort of allegiance to a homeland. There's really no uh, higher thing other than himself that all of his work points back to. Everything, the end that he's trying to reach is ultimately self-serving. There's no allegiance higher than himself. Even with Mordor, sort of the homeland that he creates for himself and those that are under his dominance, there's no allegiance to Mordor. It's just allegiance to Sauron and his will.
Perfect. Um, I wanted to draw back from that little emphasis to the bigger picture origin of Sauron. And in particular, I think, many people that come across this series may have only been exposed to Lord of the Rings through the movies. And of course, there's an entire creation story behind Middle Earth. And Sauron, as I recall, is a Maya in origin. Would you be able to give us much insight in that respect and what that has to do with Tolkien's ideas about the corruptibility of the good or not?
Mm. Well, they can try. There are certainly people who are better equipped to answer that than I am, but, um, and so people can jump in and correct any mistakes in the comments,
Yeah.
but
Always
in my
comment.
in my understanding, and by the way, the work, the primary work that you'd be referring to in works outside of the Lord of the Rings being the Silmarillion, is probably my favorite Tolkien work. And, the Ainulindale specifically, a section of that that is his creation account, is my favorite section of any Tolkien writing. It's just beautiful, and we could spend countless hours talking about that, but to put it in a nutshell, we get to see the time and space before time and space, if you will, which is the creator god Iluvatar or Eru, who is accompanied by a host of divine beings called the Ainur. And these would be sort of similar maybe to the divine council or the Elohim or spiritual beings described in the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian tradition. And in the beginning, Eru leads the Ainur into a great piece of music, and they all sing, and they have their own part to play in the music, and all of these Ainur join in the music, which is being composed through them and led by Iluvatar. And the singing ends up directly contributing to the creation of the world and is the creation of the world. And there comes a point after the singing of the music where some of the Ainur can choose to inhabit that creation and to participate in its time and in its story. And so those Ainur that come into the world are known as the Valar, and the Valar become sort of like what in a lot of mythologies there are gods associated with parts of the creation. The gods of the ocean, or a god of the sky, a god of the earth, and so they sort of take on those capacities in the world called Arda. And there's a sort of lesser spiritual being that is still very powerful, but it's sort of in service of or in collaboration with the Valar, and those are called the Maiar. And so the Maiar, whereas you have the Valar, are kind of this ruling host of Earth, of the creation and the created order, then you have these sort of lesser beings that still obtain a great amount of power and help in ruling and having dominion over the earth and cultivating it, and helping it to grow. And so Sauron was once, I think his original name was Myron, which means admirable, if I'm not mistaken, but he was once one of these Maiar, sort of helping in the cultivation and ruling of the world.
Hmm. And then something happened.
Then something happens, right? So what's interesting, and I think in a lot of our conversation there might be fun comparing and contrasting these two different characters, but Sauron is not originally the big bad, if you will. He is preceded by Melkor, or Morgoth, who is one of these Ainur, and indeed the greatest of the Ainur. He is greatest in uh, closeness to Iluvatar, perhaps, greatest in power and his exposure to the light. And yet, even in the singing of the Ainur, he really only devises to uh, sing his own music, or rather, not. It's not even music of his own. It's just um, corruption of Eru's music. He tries to get all the other Ainur around him into chaos and into disorder with the music of Iluvatar, tries to get them to fall out of harmony and out of rhythm with Iluvatar. And so when he comes into the creation, into Arda, he continues his rebellion. He really just seeks to destroy and cause as much chaos and corruption and disorder as possible. And at this time, Sauron is actually a Maiar directly in the service of Aule, who is the god or the Valar of the earth and associated with smithing, with working uh, with forges. And so, who's the father of the dwarves, actually. And so Sauron is serving him, and actually takes some time before he gets corrupted by Morgoth. But then as he's corrupted by Morgoth, he serves Morgoth. And it says in the Silmarillion, he had a hand in everything that Morgoth did and was really only second in his evil to Morgoth because he served someone other than himself. So even though it's this evil, perverse servitude that is unto chaos and destruction, he's at least serving Morgoth, whereas Morgoth is not serving anybody. He's just uh, totally, totally chaotic.
Very interesting. I I often wonder, not that you would know this, or I don't know if any of our guests would, if there was any evidence of Tolkien borrowing from other mythologies, in particular, when you bring up the idea that they're responsible for different activities that you mentioned, blacksmithing, that account in the Book of Enoch, which purports that the divine council, the angels, however you want to ascribe the sort of heavenly magistrates
Yeah.
that are gathered together and decide to violate the human domain, they are attributed with teaching men how to make weapons, all the different technological innovations that people had, as well as magic and assorted um, potions concocted by plants, etc. Anyway,
Yeah,
just came to my mind.
I I know very little about this as well, but I know that Tolkien certainly drew on other mythologies. I think specifically Norse mythology, and I was even reading in preparation for this conversation that even just a lot of similarities between Sauron and Odin, who Odin uh, actually in basically gave he's known as the one-eyed god, which is interesting because Sauron is, represented largely in the Lord of the Rings events as sort of the one lidless eye, the evil eye of Sauron. But Odin gives his eye to have a drink from the wealth or the well of knowledge. And so he wants to have this, special knowledge, and so he gives his eye for it, and it sort of weakens him, but he ends up being able to command the dead and his army of wraiths and orc-like things, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Kinda similar to
yeah.
Sauron in that way, but it'd be interesting to dive deeper.
No, you're right. I know that the Norse mythology was particularly compelling to Tolkien for sure. Um, okay, let's talk a little bit about Sauron and Tolkien's portrayal of Sauron in particular. And the first question that I'd love to hear is your thoughts on Sauron really never being seen directly, or if so, very rarely. And any thoughts that you might have with respect to the invisibility of evil, if there is such a thing, and any thoughts that you have on that?
Mm, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's certainly every way that Sauron is presented in the events of The Lord of the Rings is intentional, and I think very effective. And even just from a practical uh, standpoint in the experience as a reader, I think the lack of description actually makes the villain much more terrifying because I noticed that as Tolkien describes Sauron and encounters with evil and with Sauron, he doesn't overly describe physical appearance. He more describes the feeling that encountering that appearance would evoke. And so
Mhm.
even like I think this is a quote from the movies. I don't know if I can't remember if it's a direct quote from the book, but I believe Legolas, talks about there's whispers of a nameless fear and a shapeless mass. It's like this ominous abstract thing that if my mind can't even really grasp what it is that I'm afraid of, it becomes much more terrifying to think of encountering that thing. And so I think even just practically, it's a really lovely literary device that ends up making Sauron much more terrifying. But I do also, I agree with you. I think it's a much more accurate depiction of our engagement with evil in our lives and in our world. And in that way, I think Tolkien does what good myth should do, which is give, you could say, a distilled, a, a dis, it could depict like a distilled depiction of true patterns that we experience in reality. So it gives it in narrative form, but it's really this distilled depiction of what we experience. So of course you mentioned Tolkien experienced horrors and evils through real life tyrants and villains like Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and himself being a veteran in World War One. Even um, he saw it play out multiple times, and so I think we see those patterns really exemplified in Sauron, where the evil is much more pervasive than personal, and in even in the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, the way that I've heard the evil talked about is much more comprehensive than just, my sin being bad things that I do. You think about God talking to Cain in the book of Genesis, warning him, saying, "Evil sin is crouching at the door, and it has a desire to master over you." So there's this much more expansive, comprehensive vision of what evil is. It's this force at work in the world, and we encounter it often through people and even in ourselves when we choose to partner with that force, when we choose to become a facilitator for that force, to exercise, um, to be partnered with it, and to be part of causing evil in the world. A lot of times when we encounter it, it's through people, but it's much bigger than that. It's much more comprehensive than that. It's this infection and poison that seems to pervade all things. And so I think it's accurately and effectively described and portrayed by Tolkien through Sauron as um, much more this lurking dominance that seems to be felt all throughout the creation and not confined to one individual person.
Right, and insidious in its nature, but cloaked in darkness, hidden in plain sight, as it were. I'm curious if you have any thoughts theologically, philosophically, to the notion of evil as privation, if you think that it has a life of its own, or if it is simply the absence of good.
Yeah, I do think that it's, in this, you find this talked about really well in St. Augustine and uh, even Boethius, I think. Again, I'm no expert on this, but I do that view really resonates with evil being not a thing of its own, but a privation of a true thing. If you think about examples like darkness is no thing, it's no substance, it doesn't own its own substance. It's just a lack of light being present, and when light comes, it doesn't drive out the darkness and force it to go elsewhere. It transforms the darkness into light, and it becomes the fabric of light. And you think about a lie. A lie, no, you can't just invent a lie. It actually, a lie relies upon a truth to precede it. A lie can't be anything on its own but a rejection of something true. And so we find that the only things that are, all that is, truly is good, because the only one who can create things, being God, um, is totally good. And he brings order to things and creates things. He is the only giver of life and the only creator. And so within that creation, we as members of that creation, even though, it's kind of the great shame of anyone who is evil and tries to take apart the work of God, is that ultimately they are works of God themselves. They're only afforded that chance because they were created. And that's where you have this great irony of a thing like nihilism, where it seeks to kind of destroy life, but it's using its life to do that.
Right, right.
That irony can't be escaped. I do agree with that evil is not a thing in itself, but only a corruption of what is good, a privation of what is good.
What do you think about Sauron's desire for control? And do you see any distinguishing features of Sauron from other literary or fictional villains generally?
Well, again, I think, and I'd love to hear if any come to mind for you as well that would be fun to think about. Uh, one that comes to mind, that again is an interesting distinction with Sauron is Morgoth, who obviously exists within the same literary world, but their motivations are somewhat different in that um, Morgoth again is really just interested in causing chaos and destruction. He really doesn't have much organization or uh, much order to what he's doing. It's really just to pervert and corrupt anything that he can find that wasn't made by him. And so even it says, even I think in the Silmarillion, reflecting on Morgoth, that he really didn't even have, even though he technically participated in the singing of creation, he really doesn't have much knowledge of the music of Iluvatar or of the Ainur because he wasn't listening. He was just consumed with causing chaos and dissent and disorder. So he really doesn't know all that much about who he's even fighting or what he's trying to tear down. He's just trying to tear it down. Whereas uh, Sauron is much more attentive. He's much more focused. He's much more cunning and crafty. He was good at the time of the singing of the Ainur, and so he participated in that and is knowledgeable of the music of creation. And he was serving under Aule, and so he understands the use of order and of organization. But we almost get these two sides of evil, or these two faces of evil, when we look at Morgoth and Sauron. There's, I think, and this also gives us a really good picture of what goodness is and how goodness operates. In that, I think um, goodness operates often in what we see, even in the scriptures as well, is multiplicity in unity. What I mean by that is that obviously in the creation account of Genesis, we see beginning not with nothing, materially speaking, but with a raging ocean and unformed land. All is chaos. All is mere potential. There's sort of infinite potential, infinite raw material, but nothing that's formed yet, nothing that is. And so God comes and provides order to that chaos. He takes the raw materials and creates ordered beings, and he names them and he gives them a purpose. And that's what it is to be something, to be ordered into something, to have a purpose and to have a name in accordance with that purpose. So, what we see with, oh, sorry, I might need to trim this part out. I lost my train of thought there.
Talking about,
Oh,
Morgoth?
multiplicity in
Yeah,
unity.
yeah.
Yeah. But what we see is that there's not a total erasure uh, of chaos or of multiplicity, but we have a synthesizing of it and ordering of it. So you can think about the things that resonate as most beautiful and satisfying to us, like been watching some football recently with things getting closer to the playoffs. It's like something about watching a football team, all these players on the field, and when the quarterback drops back to give a pass and he throws it and it goes up in the air, there's so much that could go wrong, but all of a sudden all these pieces work together. There's a completed pass. It's like, oh, that's so satisfying to watch. And it's because we're watching multiplicity in order, all according to the same purpose, aimed at the same goal. And when it happens, it's so satisfying. Or an orchestra, a symphony, all these disparate instruments that are all different in their quality and in their character, but they come together playing each their own part in all of their multiplicity, but they're unified in their multiplicity and they create order. Now, if we go too far to one side or the other, too far into multiplicity, we get chaos, and that is not satisfying. It's disruptive and it's dissonant. Or on one side, we get too much order, and it actually becomes tyrannizing, and it's too predictable. It's also not satisfying. And so we almost see both sides of that coin with Morgoth and with Sauron. Morgoth bends towards utter chaos. There's no order, there's no organization, and it's just pure destruction. But Sauron employs order and organization too much, and we get order that ultimately ends in fracturing and multiplicity because it can't hold itself together.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were referencing element of too much order, and in particular, you were using the analogy of a symphony, and I know you're a musician and a talented singer, but I I think what I keep going back to is the uh the absence of spontaneity as a form of beauty and creative expression within the framework of the structure of, whatever the music is. I think the same can be said as you described an athletic performance, where so often the practice and the repetition of the skill
Mm,
gives a person the freedom to call an audible, as they do in football, and
yes.
still create something really exquisite. Um, and that only happens when there is an element of, I wouldn't say it's necessarily self-sovereignty, but it is a trust. I guess that's the word
Yeah.
that I've been hunting down for the last minute. Like that, when control is over relied upon, it reveals an absence of trust, right?
Yes. I think that's extremely accurate. That what you see in something like an orchestra, what resonates with us, what we find most beautiful is you think about on the one hand, if all of the instruments started playing in their own key and in their own time signature, it would be horrible to listen to. No one wants to hear that. On the other hand, if all of the instruments started playing the same note, not even in a cadence, it was just one droning note, or they were playing it in a cadence and it was just one note after one note after one note. It's too predictable. It would drive you crazy to listen to that. And so on the other hand, there's this beautiful in between where instruments are playing different melodies, but they're somehow in harmony. And then maybe they create dissonances, but it's weaved back into harmony. And we start to feel things just when they're being so far apart that it's like, it's almost not beautiful anymore. And then it resolves and the resolve actually becomes more beautiful because of how almost not beautiful it just was. And those are the things that you want to listen to. Those are the things that are surprising and engaging. And so yeah, certainly we find that with Sauron, that it's just sort of, I think even his music in the movies sort of reflects that. Anytime it's the orcs, it's just these grating kind of drums beating ceaselessly, and all
Yes,
the
and
yeah,
and
very
and
mechanical
the
sounding.
sorry, and those drum beats are, um, what's the word? Enhanced, amplified, supplemented by the trudging march of the
Yes.
Orakai, right? So it's just
Yes.
duh, duh, duh. Um, I should probably, record that, what I just did. That was pretty exceptional. Um,
Yeah.
there's there's a reason I don't imitate anyone. I'm not good at impersonating. Uh,
I'm gonna make that your ringtone. Every time you
yeah,
call me, it's just gonna be doo, doo, doo.
that sounds good. Yeah.
And before I forget, I think one of the striking realities about that, what the truths that we're talking about here are that, again, running with this orchestra metaphor, when they engage in, I love your point about trust, and I would say in music and in other things that can be seen through collaboration. Um, what that results in almost always is something greater than what one person could produce themselves. The one is allowed the chance to participate in something far more beautiful and striking than what they could have produced themselves. You sit back in awe of a gorgeous symphony, and each instrument is dignified. In as much as it participated in the whole of that music, and the real irony of the the motivations of evil are that if you have one of those instruments that, imagine in an orchestra, one of the instruments did just start playing in its own key and in its own time signature, not only would the whole orchestra suffer as a result of that, but that one instrument would be embarrassing. Like
Right.
um, it would lose its ability to participate in anything beautiful and meaningful and significant. And so we actually see that, I think, play out really interestingly in a lot of the characters in The Lord of the Rings, where you see the promise that Sauron presents, of power and of control. And he kind of banks on people having the same desires he does, to have control, to have power. And he entices them, he seduces them through their own desire. And he makes them think that they could be powerful, that they could have a lot of control and a lot of influence. And yet they find themselves slaves. They find themselves enslaved to Sauron's desire and Sauron's will. You think of Saruman the White, who is the most powerful of all the wizards, and revered throughout all of Middle Earth, and becomes a total puppet to Sauron and ends up a beggar and dying in the end, because he sought to be the greatest of all the wizards, which he already was. You know, you think about
Yeah.
Adam and Eve being invited by the Satan to share of the fruit because they could become like God. Well, they were already made in his image, but in reaching out to take it for yourself, you actually lose the very thing you were trying to take. And so for all those that end up dealing with Sauron and with evil, you see this infinite regression of evil play out, where you go from being Saruman the White, the greatest of wizards, to a beggar that is a total puppet and dies and has um can't do anything of his own will anymore because he's totally enslaved to Sauron. You see orcs they're a perversion of elves. They were once glorious creatures, and yet they become disgusting, creatures that are even a little bit silly and don't really have much power. Um, and on the flip side, we see with those who engage with goodness, those who actually, in contradiction to that seduction to power on hand, end up sacrificing something, end up giving of themselves for that sake of their homeland or for their people, for something bigger and greater than themselves, the music of the orchestra. They end up, time and time again, transcending their previous identity and actually becoming something greater than themselves. And so you have Aragorn, who began as sort of this mysterious, unknown, ranger who's just sort of has no land of his own, really, becoming king of Gondor. And effectively the ruler of the next age. And you have probably Gandalf, actually. Gandalf, who is Gandalf the Grey, ends up taking the seat of Saruman the White because he sacrificed, because he laid down for something greater. He didn't accept the ring when it was offered to him, and he becomes the most powerful wizard. You have my favorite example, which is Merry and Pippin, who are little hobbits, and through participating in that thing greater than themselves, through their sacrifice, end up becoming actually physically taller, right? They come back larger than the other hobbits, and they're riding horses and they're carrying armor. They become war heroes. Like, who ever heard of a hobbit becoming a war hero? But you see on the other side of the infinite regression of evil, you see the infinite progression of good. And it's counterintuitive, but when we sacrifice and give up ourselves, we give up our lives for the greater good, we end up actually becoming more than we ever thought we could be.
Thank you so much. I have nothing to add. I would like to have you share your thoughts on how that grasping occurs that you described, and particularly the device of the ring. And I think this is commonplace in any story where you have a character that's not embodied. There must be a vessel in the physical realm that can be utilized, right? And Tolkien has chosen the rings of power, and the one ring to rule them all. Just your thoughts on that device and on his choice, as well as what he's communicating to us about power and compromise.
Yeah. Again, Sauron is he's pretty intelligent. He's pretty bright. And so what he employs to exercise his will is really interesting to pay attention to. There's even before getting into the ring and just watching the same dynamic play out, but in some of the events from the Silmarillion, after Morgoth is cast down, Sauron is sort of just at large in Middle Earth, and he ends up being captured by a group called the Númenóreans, who eventually, that's who Aragorn descends from. It's this really glorious race of men, um, who were kind of just a absolutely flourishing kingdom in Arda, and they end up capturing Sauron. But what he does is he takes inventory of what's happened to him. He's become a prisoner. But what Sauron does time and time again is he's aware of his weaknesses and he plays on the strengths of others and bends them to his will. So, okay, if I'm in a position of weakness, I'll just use the strengths of those around me to exercise what I want to see happen. He's a master manipulator. And so he ends up manipulating the rulers of Numenor and ends up going from a prisoner to basically running the country. And it's I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent there, but it's really interesting the way that he does that. And we could save that for another conversation. But basically, by knowing the secret motivations of those rulers of Numenor, knowing that Alpharazon, who's ruling Numenor, that he does seek power, that he does want dominion. Sauron goes, okay, I can use this. And he turns that against and exercises it for him to become actually the effective ruler of Numenor. And so that's the same dynamic that we see play out. He's aware of his limitations. He's aware of his weaknesses. He's even more aware of the strengths of others that he covets. And so he employs he comes in the form of a really glorious, the giver of gifts. His name is Anatar. And he comes under that guise of Anatar, the giver of gifts, to the elves and convinces the elven smiths to help him create these rings that are going to be more glorious creations than they've ever dared conceive they could create before. So of course he lures the elves into this seduction of power and of control, and he gives these rings out to other people, to men, to dwarves, to every race. And it's interesting, the ring is such a perfect symbol because the ring is a symbol and a tool of covenant, of binding oneself to someone or something else. The ring is binding. I married my wife and I put on a ring. I am effectively binding myself to my wife covenantally. And so Sauron knows this. And so what he does is he uses the desires that he knows other people have to bind their desires to himself, to bind them to himself. And now, through their desire, they become the means for him exercising his desires and his wills. And he imprisons them and he enslaves them to their own desires. It really is such a good picture of what evil does and what, we would say sin does to us. Like, it totally lures us in and seduces us with our own desires, almost always promising power or the ability to become something greater than I already think I am, to become someone that can have attention, that can have influence, that can have power over other people. And as soon as I reach up to take that, the great irony is that I now become a slave to my own desires. I now become ensnared and I can't get myself out. And that's time and time again what people have happened to them when they fall into that snare that Sauron presents through the ring.
Yet it continues to entice and seduce.
Correct.
No matter how many times I have grabbed the ring and felt myself burn and regret it, it remains tempting.
Well, and what's interesting is that evil always incites its own downfall. Through, because you think about it, even at the end with um, the ring dominates Frodo's will in the end. Like, that's one of the most frustrating scenes in the whole thing, because Frodo makes it all this way, not succumbing to the power of the ring. And then ultimately, at the moment he could cast it away and be rid of it and destroy it, he is dominated by the will of the ring through his own will, right? But it's in that moment, by him actually choosing to not pull it away, is what allows Gollum to have the time to rush in, and they get into into their wrestling match and Gollum falls in. It's through these two that have been ensnared and through their own fighting and trying to gain control and power over the other, through that very struggle, that the ring is cast back literally into the fire that it was forged in. And by its own devices, it was destroyed.
Right.
Um, at which there's actually I wanted to pull it up. There's a quote in the Silmarillion that is just so it's too beautiful not to read, and it's
Give it
pretty
to me.
short, but I think this is going all the way back to the Ainulindale, to the creation of all things,
Okay.
and Morgoth has been trying to sow all of his discord and bring that music into chaos, and he doesn't succeed in doing that. But Iluvatar speaks and says, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor, Morgoth. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, those things that you have sung, I will show them forth that you will see what you have done. And you, Melkor, will see that no theme can be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." And so you see Iluvatar calling it from the beginning. You can try to sow whatever discord you want. You can try to destroy whatever you want. Ultimately, you will prove to be my instrument in the end in allowing Sauron to continue his mission. You know, Sauron exacts his own end.
Right. The devil always overplays his hand.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that I'd love to touch on, and we'll come back to Sauron's end towards the conclusion of our conversation, but I am curious about Sauron as a critique of industrialization and modern mechanization and dominion over nature. So I think it's very explicit. I don't really think it's hidden at all, but any commentary you'd have to make about that that you feel like is worthy of the conversation.
Right. Well, of course, this is an issue that was very close to Tolkien, and um, I do think one of the main themes that he explores in his works. But we see again the perversion of something good, technology and um, technology progression, industry. These aren't evil things in and of themselves, but when they're employed by evil motives and for evil ends, they become they're totally corruptive and destructive. And so Tolkien, of course, as we've already mentioned, sees these things firsthand. I mean, in Nazi Germany, it's like that was a well-oiled machine. That was extremely ordered and organized, and it was a machine. And yet its order and organization and machine and industry and progress uh, and unity, really unto destruction and chaos. And so I think that's Tolkien. There are many cautionary tales throughout the Lord of the Rings, but I think that would be one of the cautionary tales that, hey, progress, industry, technology, these things are not evil in and of themselves, but we have to be so careful with how we treat them and how we utilize them because if we're not ready for them yet, or if we don't know how to use them with true wisdom or with truly good desires, they will become agents and tools of destruction and chaos and death ultimately.
Yeah. I I think the challenge lies in who defines what's too much.
Mm.
Because I think that we all have different tolerances. I think that the vast majority of people could come to a conclusion on certain limits, right? I mean, I think pretty broadly slavery is thought of now as evil. Um, and yet there are many, many degrees along the spectrum of modern technology that you can find a cohort of people to rail against and a cohort of people to support. So,
Mhm.
um, I wish that it were as simple as it appears to be in Tolkien's realm. That
Right.
basically you you can live in the Shire and you're fine, but anything kind of beyond that level of small time farming
For
and
sure. Yeah.
and communal living, it might is evil. Yeah. So it's tough to say.
Yeah, I think I think I really appreciate what you're saying. I think it's Chesterton that, uh reflects that progress is not a destination in itself, but only a descriptor of how much one has advanced towards their destination. We hear progress given as a destination so often today. It's virtuous to be progressive, but that's what are we progressing towards? If we're progressing towards the edge of a cliff, then progress is actually a terrible thing. We should stop progressing. We should start regressing away from that cliff.
Right.
And so I think we have to take a second to ask, what are we progressing towards? Why are we progressing towards it? And then let that inform whether progress is, a virtue or a vice that we should be rid of.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up old Gilbert Keith. Uh, he
He's never far, is he?
no, I always go back and his prose is completely different, but I find the same joy in reading his writing as I do Cormac McCarthy's.
Mm,
Um, just singular voices in their own domain and completely
yes.
different types of writing. I get all that, but when you're reading Chesterton, even if no one's telling you who you're reading. And I think we'll have to do a GK series here on the Plunge for
Well, that would be
sure.
wonderful.
Yeah. I want to, but I want to move a little bit beyond like London centric thinkers for the
There's just so
channel.
much there.
I know. Anyway, back to let's leave London for now and go back to Middle Earth. Uh, what are your thoughts about Sauron's use of intermediaries at every turn? There's almost never a direct confrontation with Sauron. And what does that speak to about his nature or its nature? We keep giving him the masculine, but I don't know that he's necessarily able to procreate.
Yeah. Well, I think
Mm.
there's probably an element in in the events of the Lord of the Rings where he acts through intermediaries out of necessity rather than preference. He's essentially been bodily done away with, and part of this is that he poured so much of his malice and his will into the ring. Again, an example of trying to exercise power and yet actually weakening himself, kind of, inciting his own end there. When the ring is then taken away from him, he loses so much of his ability to act personally in the world. Same thing happens with Morgoth too. Actually, this is another interesting aside, but Morgoth's ring, as it were, which is actually the title of a book I haven't read, but I've heard about. Morgoth's ring is the earth itself. So Morgoth pours so much of his malice and his evil and his ill will into the earth and sort of poisons and pollutes the earth with the residue of his evil
Hmm.
will.
Hmm.
And so that's why in Tolkien's world there is this pervasive evil that somehow inhabits all of creation, is because that's Morgoth. It's residue of Morgoth. But in doing that, he weakened himself to the extent that he could kind of be done away with. And so the same thing happens with Sauron. As soon as the ring is removed, he is weakened and kind of unable to take form for himself. And so by necessity, he ends up being much more elusive, but again, ever aware of his weaknesses and how to capitalize on them. He seems to use that to his advantage. And so we hear these, like I was saying earlier about Legolas, the, whispers of a nameless fear in a shapeless mass. He is a shadow and a lurker, and ends up through things like the ring as an intermediary, being able to seduce and deceive because he's not seen playing out in the open. Sometimes if you see it in the open, you can kind of call it what it is. Oh, that's evil. I should run away from that. But
Hmm.
when the evil is actually proposed and put forth as something good and enticing, or potentially not all that harmful and maybe even weak, it's much
Or
easier to give into it,
beautiful,
or
right?
beautiful.
Right.
Right, right. And so it becomes much more difficult to recognize right away and go away. I think there's even whether or not it was intended. We could give the benefit of the doubt and assume it was because of Tolkien's brilliance. I think there's even a parallel here in how out in the open the evil is portrayed in the First Age, those events in the Silmarillion, versus how much more hidden they are in the Second Age. I think there's a parallel there to even our experience of humanity across time, right? Before, in ancient times, it seems that they lived in a much more enchanted view of the world. They could engage with spiritual beings and spiritual voices, forces, and beings um, much more personally, and kind of know the names and the and the faces of who they were talking to. Um, and so in ancient myth, there's much more awareness of the spiritual world. And yet today, we have a very disenchanted view. We don't recognize the things that we're talking about plainly. We don't think that there are spiritual forces out there um, behind, what we see. It's just, oh, that's just another political movement, or that's just another war happening. That's just another disease. That's just another, natural occurrence. That's just someone making another bad decision. And yet we kind of fail to see the animating forces behind these, which are enslaving and acting through those events as their intermediaries. And so I think that, again, this becomes really a cautionary tale to us today as we look at Sauron kind of acting in the shadows, acting hidden, acting through intermediaries. Even if that begins out of necessity for him, he really ends up using it to his advantage to much more subtly um, ensnare and entice people into his will.
Yeah. Oh man. You know what I love, Turner, is that we do this many a time when there's no camera rolling, but we could just chat about these things endlessly. Um,
But we could.
we could, and we shall for the rest of our lives.
And
Uh,
beyond.
yes. Well, depends if you're a modernist or not. Anyway,
True, true.
uh,
Okay, just for the rest of our lives.
there we go. Uh, let me. Well, I am anything but a modernist. However, I probably embrace innovation more than most people who uh, hold the more supernatural ideas that I contend with and believe in. It, yeah, we're all just a contrast, aren't we?
Yeah.
Um, that's okay. Let me ask you just three more things. Believe it or not.
All right.
Uh, Boy, what order do I want to take here? I'm going to take the order that I have already concocted for myself. And you had mentioned a little bit about Eastern Orthodox thinkers. Uh, and we know that Tolkien is a Catholic and has a particular worldview in that regard. And we've talked a little bit about the idea of evil as privation. Any thoughts that you want to illuminate for us with respect to theological perspectives on Sauron that Tolkien was demonstrating in the either construction of the character or the way in which the character uh, lived? I, it's hard to say it lived in a way because it's not the same life that you or I share, but you know what I mean.
Right. Well, yeah, there's a quote when Tolkien is describing Sauron and specifically his eye, where he talks about um, the eye being as I'll fail to remember the exact words, but it's yellow as a cat. It's as a cat's eye, and it's lidless. It's static. It's not moving, and the in that it's not blinking, and that its pupil is the black slant that is a window into nothingness, I think is what he says. And that, I think, depicts what we're talking about with these ancient views of evil, which is that it is nothingness. Like it is nothing. And we experience it as something, uh, but in the end, it is nothing. And everything that, I suppose everything that's been made can be corrupted, but everything that's been corrupted can be healed and can be restored. And restoration is far more devastating uh, of an end for evil than punishment.
Hmm.
you know, to of course, we'll reference George Mack here, our
Thank you.
uh,
Thank you. Took
the
you long enough.
the patron the patron saint of this podcast.
That's
But
right.
uh, but you know, it is not evil. What is it? It's not evil dead, but good where evil was. That is truly evil dead. Or now I'm getting the
Only
quote wrong.
good where evil was is evil dead.
There you
An
go.
evil thing must live with itself until it chooses the good. That
Yes,
alone is the slaying of evil.
there you go. Healing and restoration, transformation. These things obliterate evil because it truly ceases to exist, and it never existed anyways. And it can sound. I don't mean that in a flippant way. We
Right.
experience very real horrors and terrible things, like terrible. There are terrible, terrible atrocities and evils that are being done. Um, and yet all of them are only perversions and corruptions and attempted destructions at something that is made and is good. And our hope, and as Christians, our hope in Christ is that all things can be healed, all things can be restored, all things can be reconciled, all things can be brought back into harmony. Again, that musical metaphor of things reaching dissonance but being woven back into harmony. What Iluvatar says to Melkor, you thought you were doing your own thing, but the only reason you even have your existence to do your own thing is because I made you. You will be my instrument in the end. And so this is an inescapable reality for the enemy. The the Satan, really thought it had won when Christ went down into death. It thought, now I'm consuming God. Now I've got him captured. I've got him right where I want him. And he's the reason that death came into the world. Like it's Christ uses the very mechanism that was invented by the enemy to steal his creation away from him and to corrupt and kill his creation and enslave his creation to death, enslave humanity to death. Christ uses the very mechanism of death to birth life for all things, to invite all things, to be the pathway and the doorway. It becomes the doorway to eternal life. Again, it's just the evil inciting its own end, being the inventor of its own demise. Um, it just can't help it. And so I think those are really profound theological insights that Tolkien explores and expresses in The Lord of the Rings that certainly we can find resonances, and I'm sure were served as the inspiration for Tolkien, as we find those things in the Christian tradition.
Wonderful. Uh, Thank you again for referencing George Mack. Um, in what ways does Sauron, and you've touched on this, but any other thoughts you have on him embodying the concept of evil as self-enslavement?
Mm.
Because
Well,
as I
yeah.
understand it, his power itself becomes bound to the ring, right? Which is why the ring must be destroyed in order for Sauron to be destroyed. But yeah, please.
Well, it's this paradox of being enslaved to one's self will, like by me trying to reach up and take something from myself, I become ensnared to that desire. It creates an attachment for that thing, and I'm ensnared to it. And this is really, I think, a good, a really good principle to explore. But even going back to the Garden of Eden with this fruit of the tree of life and this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Also in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, we have that. Um, you see the church fathers talking about that God wanted ultimately to give Adam and Eve the knowledge of good and evil. Really, what he wanted to give them was wisdom, but on his terms and on his time, because he knows what's best for his children. And so ultimately, if they're going to have dominion over creation. He wants to teach them how to do it in a way that's going to be best for them and best for creation and cause for the flourishing of all things. And that is wisdom, you know? Um, and so if they would have received wisdom from God, they would have actually become what he made them to be, which is kings and queens, rulers, having dominion. They would have become something much greater than they were. The Eastern Orthodox tradition teaches that Adam and Eve were not, um, in the fullness of their intended purpose yet, but that they were potential. They were like children, and so in their own naivety, um, they didn't receive the teaching of their father, who would have seen them become kings and queens, and yet this the so it's not the thing in itself. It's not the knowledge of good and evil in itself that was bad, but it's the mode of having it. Instead of receiving it as a gift, which they would then at that point properly be able to utilize, they reach up and take it for themselves on their own terms, on their own time, and they weren't actually ready for it. And so it rules them, it dominates them. Now the creation has the upper hand over Adam and Eve. He can't, Adam can't produce good things out of the earth quite as easily. Childbirth becomes painful. Relationships become tumultuous and subject to division and treachery. And so we become enslaved to this thing that we helped create by thinking we were going to be able to take something for ourselves and really gain. We end up losing everything we thought we would gain. So that's what we see play out with Sauron, where he really just is totally enslaved and ensnared to his own desire for power. He needs to have control. He needs to have others bound up to himself, and so he creates this device of the ring, in order to achieve that goal. And yet the ring itself becomes something that when it's taken from him, weakens him greatly. And then ultimately, by being able to destroy the ring, he himself is effectively destroyed. Um, and Gandalf talks about this after he goes and fights the Balrog, I believe. And when he comes back as Gandalf the White, and he's reflecting now on what he's learned. I think that's when it is, but it's basically a speech he gives some of the Fellowship about what he's learned. And he learns that Sauron does know about the Fellowship, and he does know the members of the Fellowship, and he knows that they have the ring, even, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But what Sauron assumes is that they have the same will that he does, the will for power and the will to control. So he assumes that they're going to Minas Tirith, I think it is, and that they're going to try to, get in a position of power there. And so Sauron starts preparing for war. Okay, well, if they're going to go to war with me because they want power over me, well, I'm going to build an army and I'm going to go to war with them. I'm taking the battle to them. And so he moves quickly, and he moves too hastily. If we learned anything from the Ents, don't be hasty. But what Gandalf says is that what hasn't entered his mind yet is that we would seek to destroy the ring itself, that they would take the ring to the fires of Mount Doom, because he assumes that he
W
can't conceive of anything outside of his own deluded
Yeah,
will for power.
nobody how could anyone possibly want to destroy the ring, right? It's the
Right.
source of all the power
It's
that you can dream of.
exactly. And so that becomes for his wise, well, not wise, but as knowledgeable and cunning as he is a fool. And that's Gandalf says that. He says, wise fool. And you see that again. Saruman is the wise fool, greatest of the wizards, totally falls when he's enslaved to his own passions, to his own desires. So if Sauron spent all of his energy and all of his resources on building a barricade around Mount Doom and protecting Mount Doom, like they never would have destroyed the ring. But he's hasty, and he assumes other people have the same corrupt wills for power that he does. And so, um, yeah, again, he is the wielder of his own destruction.
And how frequently characters and real people reveal their own internal motivations by their anticipation and expectation of what others will do, which amounts to a projection of their own heart
Mm,
onto the other.
yeah.
Last question, Turner.
We've made it.
We did it. My goodness, we're amazing. What do you think Tolkien has to say about collaboration, leadership, domination? Uh, yeah. I- what is he revealing to us about life today with the particularly the temptation to uh, say the ends justify the means?
Mm. Well, man, there's so much there. One of the words that you said that reminded me of something was domination, and this is not original to me. There's a lot of this that I've said isn't original to me. There's just really great. Uh, there's one really great resource out there, the Amun Sul podcast, which is uh, a couple of fellow Lord of the Rings nerds who are also Orthodox priests that have a whole podcast talking about the Lord of the Rings.
How does one spell that?
Amun Sul, this is the recommended reading. Next reading, if you liked this podcast and this series, Amun Sul is AMON
All
and I
right.
think it's available on all platforms, but lots of deep dives there. But one thing I heard on an episode of Amun Sul talking about Sauron specifically, actually, is and evil in Tolkien's Legendarium is this distinction between uh, dominion and domination. And I think
Okay.
that that's a really interesting distinction to make. And again, we have this language of dominion, in the biblical creation account of Genesis, where God creates Adam and Eve to be rulers, to be kings and queens, to have things in their rule. Like God shares in his rule with his creation. It's an incredible amount of dignity that he places on his creation. And yet, when those creatures seek to take that rulership on their own terms and for themselves, what they're seeking is rather than dominion over the creation, domination. And one results in the flourishing of the creation. Um, and it's even the giving of the self for the flourishing of creation. And domination is the inversion of that, where we have the taking of creation for the flourishing of the self. And so God ultimately um, is self-sacrificial, and he is, even from the beginning, giving of himself and his own life and his own nature so that other things could have life, so that there could be a creation in the first place, so that there could be things to share his life. So he gives of the self for the flourishing of the other. And yet what evil does is it tries to take of the life of other things. It's vampiric in that way. It sucks the life out of other things to sustain its own life, but that own life becomes a half-life. It's not a life worth having. It's an enslavement. It's destructive. And so of all the things, that was one of the first things that you mentioned, but as that pertains to leadership, to the ends justifying the means, there are many leaders put forth in the Lord of the Rings. And I think it's just really good for us to read The Lord of the Rings again, being, I think, a very potent myth, giving distilled depictions of real, true patterns that we experience in reality, to pay attention to those leaders. How are they leading? Why are they leading? What are they leading towards? And whereas Sauron kind of uses this promise of unity, of being a part of something, but it's ultimately self-serving. It's serving him, and it's causing destruction and chaos. Hey, let's maybe pay attention to leaders out there who are giving a rallying cry to be united to something, to a cause. But what are their motivations, and what are they using to motivate your following of them? Are they playing on your desires? Are they using your desires that may or may not be good desires? Are they using my desire for power or for influence, or for my
For
own? Is it self-serving?
vengeance,
What
right?
was that?
Vengeance.
For vengeance? For revenge? Are they using my own desires and things that I would like to take for myself, and are they saying, hey, here's a way of reaching out and taking that here, let's gather around that, let's come be a part of something, and we're going to see this happen. And we can kind of see how that plays out in the Lord of the Rings, and I think we see that play out time and time again in reality. And on the flip side, there are rulers put forth like Aragorn, and Gandalf, who are not seeking their own ends, who oftentimes are very real about what they're inviting people into. Hey, we're going into death. Like they're talking about what's being laid down rather than what's being laid up for us. I'm asking you to lay down your life. I'm asking you to lay down everything. It's self-sacrificial. It's self-giving, and celebrating the multiplicity. That's one of my favorite things. We see on the one side, Sauron with his sort of chronic uh, order that's really a tyranny, gathering a multiplicity gathering an order of things that ends up leading to fracture and disintegration. And on the other hand, we see multiplicity in unity very well on the other side, where all the different races come together. The dwarves and the elves and the men, they all team up and come together and use their strengths like an orchestra, like a symphony, to put forth this music that contributes to something greater than themselves. And like we were saying earlier, they all end up transcending their previous identities and becoming something greater. And so it's just really interesting to look at, who are the leaders around us? What do their motivations seem to be? What are they asking of me? And what methods are they employing to ask my joining them? And referencing then Tolkien's work, what kind of end can I expect from joining a cause like that that's on offer potentially?
Burnett from Tennessee, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's always an honor and a pleasure.
Let's hold up that shirt one more time. There he
There it
is.
is.
Just something else. Have you worn that anywhere?
Well, yeah, quite frequently actually. I have a sweatshirt too that's from the same place. I wish I could remember the website so I could tell people about it, but it's a Witch King of Angmar sweatshirt. So the Witch King, he's just got the coolest helmet, all the spikes,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Just
I've got that
glorious.
sweatshirt. Yeah,
Just like this conversation.
just like this conversation.
Goodbye. Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the poem One Ring. Of course, the episode is about Sauron. Thank you, Ring, for your poem. Thank you, Professor Tolkien, for sponsoring today's episode. Let us begin. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky. 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. 9 for mortal men doomed to die. 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all. 1 ring to find them. 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie.